For peace and justice, they make a point of remembering decades of racial division and racist attacks. There are 800 steel monuments hanging here, one for every county where lynchings took place, including many in Mississippi. And it's that history that has made supposedly light-hearted comments about a hanging so controversial.
I would find a circle song for him if he invited me to a public hanging at me on the front row.
Cindy Hyde-Smith, who's the Republican candidate in today's Senate election, has since apologised for her choice of words. But at polling stations today, there were some voters reluctant to forgive her.
I thought they were very hurtful because we've come a long way and everybody needs to learn to love and get along with each other. So it was very hurtful.
It's time for that to go and not to even be coming out from anybody's mouth, no matter what. So, and we hold on to it in Mississippi.
Race has become an issue in an election where her opponent Mike Espy is African American, and some companies have asked Cindy Hyde-Smith to return their campaign donations.
They all said that her comments did not reflect the values of their company. Well, they don't. Her comments don't reflect the value of our state.
President Trump flew into Mississippi on the eve of the election to hold not one but two rallies. This should be a safe Republican seat, but Cindy Hyde-Smith's comments have left the outcome of this vote anything but certain.
Chris Buckler there in Jackson, Mississippi. The result of the vote won't have any real effect on the Senate, where the Republicans control 52 seats and the Democrats 47. Scientists have expressed anger and Chinese authorities have ordered an investigation after a Chinese scientist claimed to have edited the genes of twin girls before birth. He Jiankui said he'd used a gene editing tool to modify a particular gene in 2 embryos to stop the HIV virus entering cells. If his claims are true, scientists say it creates a host of ethical and medical problems. Deutsche Welle's Matthew Day spoke.
You'll be way too much in the shot if that's the question you move a little bit. You won't mind me like... I don't, you'll be way too much in the shot.
I like to move because I'm in his shot. Sorry.
Well, okay, well, I'm going to be sitting there as well, so people are going to be in the shot. Maybe you go higher?
Do you want to move a seat up to there?
Yeah.
It's all move along.
Yeah.
It works.
No, you're right.
Raise the
That won't really make a difference.
Okay.
If we can move those seats to get a little bit closer. What was your question?
She's being a brat.
What were you saying?
He gave us such a good scoop.
I'll check with her. I'll check with her.
No, let's call it.
I'll check with her.
We're going to go get pushed over Prime Minister.
So she's got that stand up. It's very quick, so it's because she has to get on a flight back. So it's going to be a very quick stand up. There's an advisory went out from Leah.
Yeah, I think in the advisory it doesn't say stand up, but it's statement. So
We know that.
yeah, we're going.
Did Barry? Did he say that there is going to be a statement?
Yeah. He's making the statement. I said, well, I'd like to have the hard.
Yeah.
But also we should have had a chance to read it. Yeah. I've had a chance to read something. That would have been quite a day. Especially you know what we're going to ask questions like long-winded legalese. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Hello. Don't really feel like they're going to be many Christmas cards.
Sunlight, look. You'll hear what's going on. My hair used to look like this.
So what's your money on?
Robotics. Okay, then.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Been part of courts with me, been part of courts for 50 plus years. So he remains in New Zealand, always sentences served. Buys a $1 million white villa in Graydon. 1.5 million. Yeah. You should have gone. That was quite nice.
Yeah, someone is also
It's very optimistic for me to think of the villa in Braylon worth $1.5
Yeah,
million in 20 years.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Are you going? Are you guys breaking into radio?
Yeah.
Excuse me. They decided to go back here enough.
So they were very excited.
They're going live on the line. But
What was it? What else was yesterday?
I think it's like 50 minutes. You have to break the build. Oh, like, wow. He's going to come in and be all legal easy. Yes.
Test. Imagining how the level will be for the minister. Is that alright? That's a sit down scenario.
Cool.
Yeah.
What did you through, see me?
Is that better? Too loud? Okay. That better?
Yes, 5 years.
Next in the middle.
And how long can you get it done? 2014.
Okay, great. I'm putting my phone up now, so no communications. But message back if you need.
Oh, much better. Not so much filming there. Not big. But you
You're right, man?
cell phone. It's quite expensive.
Oh, yeah.
No.
They had you in for drinks?
Who?
Huh?
Yeah,
I know it's on my phone, but I hide it.
Are you missing?
Yeah, I do.
Do you?
Yeah. The one I was in council meeting.
Yeah.
5 years, 9 months in prison is 3 years back. Yes, RNZ, I thought that was great.
Is that, oh, yeah, no, that's what it is.
Probably would have done more.
Oh, rolling, yeah, no.
I was writing so much stories that I actually had nightmares about it.
He's always so I used to live when I was doing this.
4 years. I don't know exactly when it.
Yeah, I know.
But it was more than a year. September 2014.
No.
Yeah. September 2014. So that's what I remember.
Yeah.
He's
a good man.
He had more than a year until he needed to, maybe you might need a couple of months of knowing where to go, but I remember he had time, like, being fine up this week.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, it's politics.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Greek factual.
It's not a special, so it just works great.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Might just be here for that way.
I think it's fine.
No, but no, this one.
This little bit
Oh,
I'll
go, just drop
I'll
through.
just cuddle that, yeah.
You're going to jump up and do a monologue.
If you don't mind. Yeah. And we're crossing live now, Minister. Just zip it, sweetie.
Yeah, the AIM show have another arrangement like they did with Pike River.
Oh yeah.
No comment.
How long do we have to see?
Too soon. So yeah, she's, nobody wants to talk about that.
Oh, I do.
But apart from this. And Duncan's. You guys should get together.
Oh. That's promising.
Jason knows what. I did, yeah, it was such a common. That's right. Oh, no, this might be a huge one. This will be nice.
Right, good afternoon everybody. Can I introduce to you Greg Patchell, who is the Head of Immigration New Zealand. Greg will be available to ask any questions about Immigration New Zealand's process or technical questions as well. I have a statement to read and then I'll take any questions that you have. In the days following the publication of my decision to cancel Carol Schubeck's deportation liability, information entered the public domain that appeared to contradict information that I relied upon in making that decision. As a result, I instructed Immigration New Zealand to review the veracity of that information. As a result of that review, Immigration New Zealand determined that Mr Schubeck may be liable for deportation on grounds that I had not previously considered. RNZ sought Mr Schubeck's response and prepared a case file for me to consider, detailing the potential liability, Mr Schubeck's response and other information material to the decision I was required to make. Some of that information was not available to me when I made the original decision. This included new information from Interpol confirming details of his convictions, the fact he was present in court when found guilty, and that he appealed the verdict to the highest court in the Czech Republic. Parliament, in passing the Immigration Act 2009 and its predecessor, the Immigration Act 1987, set a minimum statutory bar on who is entitled to come to New Zealand, including certain criminal convictions. Mr Schubeck's visas, both temporary and permanent residency, were granted when his Czech convictions rendered him a person who is not able to meet that bar. Immigration New Zealand did not know this because Mr Schubeck was using a false identity. This founds a new ground for liability under the Immigration Act 2009. I have therefore determined that Mr Schubeck is now liable for deportation. I was clear with Mr Schubeck in my original decision that that decision did not affect his potential liability for deportation on other grounds. The effect of this new liability is that Mr Schubeck would have to leave New Zealand upon his release from custody and would be unable to return. Mr Schubeck has the right to appeal to the Independent Immigration and Protection Tribunal on the basis of facts and humanitarian grounds. I have previously declined to go into detail of my original decision in order to protect the integrity of the ongoing processes. However, I believe it is in the public interest that I do so now. The case was presented to me in the usual way. An immigration official provided an oral briefing and I read the 12-page summary of the case. I then discussed the case with the official, who directed me to the relevant parts of the 398-page appendices to assist my consideration of the case. There were several matters that I had to consider. Mr Schubeck was liable for deportation, having been found guilty of importing MDMA into New Zealand and because he held a residence visa under a false identity. The Immigration Act allows the Minister to intervene in cases where they believe that deportation may not be appropriate. I considered if there was any reason why Mr Schubeck ought not to be deported. Mr Schubeck and his legal representative provided extensive material making the case that his personal safety would be in jeopardy if he was required to return to the Czech Republic. He claimed that he was in danger from both a person who committed a murder that Mr Schubeck witnessed and from corrupt police officials. I considered the likelihood that these claims were misleading or at least embellished despite the considerable supporting material provided. However, there was one fact that I felt I simply could not overlook, which was that Judge Roy Wade had accepted Mr Schubeck's life would be in danger if he returned to the Czech Republic. It is difficult to dismiss such a decision from our judiciary out of hand. Judge Wade had the opportunity to hear arguments for and against the claim that Mr. Shrubik's life would be put at risk if he convicted him, and he determined that it would. Further, there were statements in that determination and others that the Crown did not dispute Mr. Shrubik's claims. Clearly, any suggestion that Mr. Shrubik had returned to the Czech Republic would have severely undermined his claims. It is apparent in the file that he travelled in and out of New Zealand several times between 2003 and 2009. The file does not state where he ultimately travelled to. I asked if it was possible to determine where he had travelled to, but I was told that this was not information that RNZ was able to access. Mr. Shrubik's return has subsequently become public. RNZ did not provide me with information relating to charges which did not result in a conviction or proceed to trial. The information was not relevant to my decision and would have been unfairly prejudicial against him. The standard of information for ministerial consideration is stringent. Evidence that he did return to the Czech Republic was contained in those court documents and was not accessed by Immigration New Zealand, nor was it easily accessible. This is one of the areas that will need to be considered in terms of future steps. In the absence of that information, and given the weight accorded to Judge Wade's determination, I found that I had to consider that there was a significant risk. Against that, I had to weigh the potential risk Mr. Shrubik posed to public safety in New Zealand. He had been convicted of importing a Class B drug. Although it appears to have been a one-off, according to the evidence available, it was a large quantity. He had also been involved in violent offences. There was clearly cause for concern. However, the file contained several points in his favour. In official documents, he was described as having no history of violence in New Zealand, no gang associations, and as presenting a low risk of reoffending. In addition, he had secured several letters of support. I gave weight to one in particular, that from his wife, who spoke highly of him and stated that even though they were separated, she was still supporting him financially and mentally. He also had job offers and had taken the opportunity to upskill while in prison to improve his chances of employment upon release. The picture presented to me was that his violent offending appeared to be in the past and that his risk of reoffending was low. I did accept that there was some risk, however, which would mean that there would have to be conditions in the event that I did allow him to stay in New Zealand. In the end, I did determine that there was a potential risk to his safety should he be deported, and that the risk he posed to public safety in New Zealand was low. However, I reached those conclusions relying on the information that was presented to me at the time. I am concerned that the case file prepared by Immigration New Zealand may not have provided a complete picture. More information on Mr. Shrubik's travel history and criminal past would have assisted in my decision making. I followed a process established by my predecessors, but ultimately the responsibility for the decision is mine. I spoke to the Prime Minister last night to explain the circumstances and convey my apology. She has accepted my apology and assurances that I will work to fix the process. My top priority now is to restore public trust and confidence in the process for dealing with these cases. All parts of the immigration system must have integrity, and I am acutely aware that trust and confidence has been damaged by this episode. This case has exposed potential limitations in my approach to casework, the material that is prepared for me, and the overall policy for cases where ministerial discretion is applied. I will immediately change my approach to casework. I will now receive the file in advance of meeting with officials and take as long as I need to scrutinise the file before that meeting takes place. This will undoubtedly slow the process, but it is important that the proper time is taken to get these decisions right, every time. Immigration New Zealand is conducting a review of the process immigration officials follow in preparing case files. This is expected to be completed in March. I have also instructed MB to begin a process to determine if the current decision-making process is appropriate and to recommend any changes that may be necessary. That will be a longer piece of work, and I expect initial advice in the near future. Public trust and confidence has been damaged. As Minister, I take responsibility for that. I also take responsibility for fixing this process and restoring that trust, and that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Did you offer your resignation to the Prime Minister?
No.
Why not?
Because I'm going to work to fix this. I'm not going to run away from this problem.
Do you feel let down by your immigration official?
Not at all. They were following the process that has been used for a long time. I do have concerns about the process. That's why I've asked for reviews to take place, but I have absolute confidence in Immigration New Zealand's
Now,
officials.
following this process down, do you admit that you were too quick to make this decision?
Look, I think that the process we have does place some pressure on the Minister to make a fast decision. That's a process that I inherited. I want to make changes to that process to make sure that the process has more integrity.
Were you conned by Carol Srubeck?
No.
The Interpol information and the information about him returning to the Czech Republic, those were both publicly available, one a Google search, one a LexisNexis search. Why wasn't that information?
I'll get Greg to deal with that one.
Good question. That information was part of his transcript in the trial where he was discharged without conviction. Under the current process, that's inadmissible to the Minister because that would arguably prejudice his decision. In other words, the conviction didn't stand, therefore that information would not be put in front of the Minister under the current process.
It wasn't about the conviction though, was it? It was about the fact that he'd travelled back to the Czech Republic potentially.
That's true. However, the record with the actual transcript in it was part of that trial. A Google search isn't enough, unfortunately, for our bar of threshold to allow the Minister to make a decision. If he relies on that and that subsequently turns over on appeal, that would be a problem.
Could you use that though to then go and get more information? So if you see it in a Google search and then go through official channels, and should you have done that?
Yeah, again, good question. The current process has case files prepared for decisions by decision makers, in this case the Minister. That is not an investigation. The investigation has been undertaken by the courts who generate a conviction. The conviction makes the individual liable or potentially liable for deportation. In the particular case the Minister considered, that conviction was the drug importation conviction. And as a consequence of that, as I said earlier, the original court case wasn't admissible because it wasn't generating that liability. The flaw in the process is what you're obviously seeing, and hence we're going to have a review to see whether that process could be adjusted to address the very question you're asking. But under the current process for a number of years, that is and remains the case.
The Interpol listing though, that was a simple Google search, and that's reliable. You know, when you pull up Interpol, that's reliable information.
The Interpol information was made available. However, regrettably in this situation, it wasn't actually directly attributable to the decision being made because the liability wasn't about that, it was about his drug offending.
Minister, do you think that Immigration New Zealand should be carrying out investigations? I mean, they're really significant decisions that you have to make, and saying that it's the court's job to make the investigation, do you think that's good enough?
And that's precisely why Immigration New Zealand are undertaking a review of these processes, and I don't want to presuppose what the result of that review might be, but that will be a robust review to make recommendations about how that could be improved.
Just to be clear, is it the Czech convictions, is that the basis on which you've changed your decision?
Yeah, so the Czech convictions meant that he did not meet the standard for having a visa issued to him. So those convictions they bring about a new liability. Obviously it's a liability that has existed, but it's not a liability that I've previously considered.
Should you have been provided with that detail?
Just to clarify the answer to your question, because Mr Shrewbeck travelled on a false identity when he originally came into the country and when he attained his initial and subsequent visas, he was technically what's referred to as an excluded person. So if he had used his actual name, which we were unaware of, he wouldn't have been permitted to get into the country at all. It's on those grounds that the Minister's to be able to find in this case.
So under his real name, convictions under his real name.
Correct.
And also
is that Karel Shrewbeck is being kicked out of New Zealand for crimes he committed in the Czech Republic, not for crimes that he committed in New Zealand.
No, he's being removed because he never had a right to hold a visa in the first place.
Do you still have concerns that his life could be in danger?
I don't want to go in too far into the details of the new decision that I've made because obviously he does have appeal rights and I don't want to prejudice any process around those appeal rights. But suffice to say, I had new information that I considered in making that new decision, and the decision I reached this time was that his deportation should proceed.
Is anyone at Immigration New Zealand losing their jobs over this?
I beg your pardon?
Is anyone at Immigration New Zealand losing their jobs over
no.
this?
Is it fair to send him back though, if his life could be in danger, and you know that?
As I say, I had new information. I think, I walked you through the process that I used in making the first decision. I used a similar process, weighed up those different factors. I had different information available to me that led me to a different conclusion.
Given that you are changing up the process now and you're going to slow it down, do you admit that you were sloppy with this case?
No.
Do you think this is a decision ministers should have when you have a lot else on your plate day to day? There's people, professionals at Immigration New Zealand who consider this full time.
Look, ultimately that may be something that comes up in the work that MB does, but for the time being, this is a responsibility that I have. It's a responsibility that I take seriously, and I will have to continue discharging that responsibility until any potential changes may happen in the future. But again, I don't want to presuppose any further work that might be done around the policy.
At any point did you offer your resignation or consider offering your resignation to the Prime Minister?
No.
Can I just ask, no, it's just gone out of my head.
Will you be reviewing any past cases given the holes in the process that you've identified?
No, I don't think that's necessary. I mean, this was an unusual case. It was a very complex case. I've not actually considered any other cases under the particular section of the Immigration Act that made Mr. Schubeck liable in this case. So I don't think that it undermines other cases, but it does demonstrate that the processes that we have at the moment do need to be reviewed to make sure that they are applicable in every case that I consider.
When you talked earlier, you said the information you got said that Schubeck didn't have any gang affiliations and it was pretty much a good citizen. Where did you get that information from, and where have you subsequently found information that changes that?
Well, look, I think a lot of that information will ultimately be able to become available, but it's not something that we're able to publish at this time. But I will say that they were official documents. Some of them were New Zealand government documents that indicated no gang affiliations, no record of violence in New Zealand, and a low risk of reoffending.
And that's not the case now. Can we? He does
I have seen new material. I'll put it that way.
Have any New Zealand authorities been in touch with Czech authorities to seek assurances that his life won't be in danger when he is deported?
No.
This is probably a question for, well, it is a question for Andrew Little, but maybe you can answer it. Has New Zealand received any extradition requests?
Oh, you'll have to ask Andrew that.
Is it, and just to clarify, being liable for deportation, does that mean the special direction has been revoked or will be revoked?
There was no special direction. And no, it doesn't. This is a new question of liability. I've made a new decision on a new question of liability.
He still holds on to that residency for now.
No, he doesn't have residency now because he's not produced a valid travel document. But this deportation decision essentially overrides that.
How long are you expecting this will be tied up in the courts? How long are you expecting this to be tied up?
Oh, look, no idea. But the truth is, had I decided to proceed, decided that his deportation should proceed the first time round, he had the same appeal rights. He could very well have gone to the IPT, for instance. So look, that's a decision for him, and it will take the time it takes.
Have you conveyed to him or his legal representatives the content of his decision?
Yes.
And did they indicate a willingness to appeal it?
The decision, they have been notified of the decision. That's all I'm aware of.
Given that he came in a false passport, does he have any right to go to the Immigration Protection Tribunal?
Under the current process, he has a right to appeal to the IPT on questions of process and also on humanitarian grounds.
But he didn't. But he's here on a false name, false visa. The minister said he no longer had. His visa was no longer relevant, so how can he go to New Zealand, represent,
Yeah, I get your question. As I understand it, the ability to appeal to the IPT isn't necessarily related to his current status per se, although it relates to the decision that the minister's taken, or if done by an official, So
judicial review then, process would be the only route that he, well, not the only route, but probably the main route that he would go down?
That's something you probably should address to his legal counsel. Yeah.
Can you confirm that deportation liability doesn't actually mean that he will be deported? It just means that he's liable.
It means he's liable for deportation. He could leave of his own accord, or if necessary, Immigration New Zealand could intervene.
When did you for
But it
release?
doesn't mean automatic deportation.
In these situations of custodial liabilities, the individual would be removed from the country at the conclusion of their sentence.
So at the conclusion of the sentence, so there's no chance that he's going to get any parole now?
That's a question for the parole board. That's not a question for me at all. That's a question for the parole board. But if at the point where he was released, whether it be on parole or at the conclusion of his sentence, Immigration New Zealand would step in and he would be removed from the country.
When is that? When do you have a time frame for when his sentence finishes? Do we know? Do you have a date?
Look, from memory, I think it's around 2022. But
Subject to parole.
Yeah.
Did Immigration New Zealand feel like the Minister was throwing you under the bus during this process?
Yeah, I can understand why you asked that question. The processes we use are good, solid processes. We've got great people doing excellent work. You asked about whether anyone's going to get fired. The answer is no. Public servants and officials follow robust processes to do their jobs. In this situation, there's a question about whether or not those processes are fit for purpose, so we're undertaking a review. So to directly answer your question, no. And we'll see what Mr Heron, who we've contracted to do the review, will say about that in March and implement his recommendations.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate what I said earlier, which is I have total confidence in the people at Immigration New Zealand. We definitely have to review these processes.
You were pretty quick to pass the buck.
When was that?
Throughout this whole process, you were blaming officials.
When was that?
When you said that the information wasn't put in front of you throughout the entire process,
Well,
when you hadn't read the entire report, you didn't do further due diligence, ask more questions perhaps about some of the things that have now come to light.
So information was there was information missing. We've discussed that this afternoon. I did ask if it was possible to get that information. I was told that it was not. But that's the process that we have available to us at the moment, and that's exactly the sort of thing that needs to be reviewed.
Who sets up the process? You mentioned that you followed the process of the previous government. So is that something that goes minister to minister? Is that how it works? Or?
No, I mean, Greg can speak to the process of producing the file, but you know, a lot of this is determined by legislation. In terms of how the minister themselves actually approaches it, that is up to us individually. But essentially, I just picked up the process that as it was described to me when I first became a minister.
Are there any concerns that, given you say this process isn't right, that perhaps other files have been overlooked and other decisions? I mean, you might be.
No, as I said, I think this is something of an outlier in terms of its level of complexity and the nature of the conviction. I think the processes that we have are probably appropriate in most cases. What we need is processes that are appropriate in all cases.
Do you think you might have an influx of people, using Carl Schubeck's case as an example for how they should be looked at again, or questioning?
Well, in fact, we haven't looked at the original decision again. A new liability for deportation was determined, and a decision was made based on that.
Yeah, but what if other reports that you've got are missing elements, and you've made a decision based on that too?
Yeah, as I say, I think the processes we have are fit for purpose in most cases, but potentially not in all cases, and that's why we need to do a review. And I don't want to presuppose the outcome of that review, but we need to do a review of the process that Immigration New Zealand uses, and also look at the actual overall policy of ministerial discretion.
So is your office preparing for the case where people are going to say this and go, oh, what about my case, and you're going to have an influx of requests and?
Well, as I say, this was a new question of liability. I've not overturned the original decision. It's a new question of liability. So it's in fact an entirely new decision.
How long do you expect that review to take?
The Immigration New Zealand one?
Yeah.
Till March.
We'd expect to get a report in March next year.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone.
Got a copy of the minister's statement, which I'll hand up to people if you need.
Electronic copies of those, Phil? Thanks.
With it, Renee.